Well, good morning again, everyone. I'm excited to preach about today's passage. It is some great news. And it's nice to get good news for a change, isn't it? I don't know about you, but every time I turn on the news, I hear phrases that are used specifically to incite me to anger, or fear, or hate, or political action, but definitely to incite ratings. I'm sure you've heard some of these phrases. I'm going to get everyone's blood pressure up. You ready? Here's the big one I've been hearing recently. It sounds like a title of a Superman comic book. The Death of Democracy. You guys have heard this one? There's other scary ones out there. Trained Marxist. Have you heard that one? Hitler, insurrection, deep state, woke agenda. Project 2025, I still haven't read what that project is. But we have these things flying about us, trying to incite us to being upset so that we're easily manipulated. If there was ever a time where a person could come home after a long day's work and eat dinner and relax in front of the TV news, it is not today. I'm not sure it ever was. I haven't been around that long. I know it's not now. And it's kind of like a chicken and egg situation, right? Our media stirs our society into a frenzy. And then as conflict and tension in our society arises, our society in return gifts our media more ammunition. We can see people all around us, brands, celebrities, our own relatives joining the frenzy. Everyone is joining the panic. Some of us even join that panic. Now, you might be expecting for me to say, as some preachers or other people do, you guys just got to relax. It's all in your head. Maybe to dismiss any concern as hyperbolic or the product of brainwashing. I won't do that today. There are plenty of reasons to feel concern about what's going on in our world. I'm consistently discouraged by the holier-than-thou attitude or the smarter-than-thou attitude that pretends that that a godly response to all these things going on in our society is some sort of disengagement or a stoic Zen Buddhist attitude. How many heroes of the faith do you know that acted that way? What about ones in the Bible? Anyone come to mind? Not me. There are real reasons for Christians to be concerned. The poor, the weak are oppressed in our society. Our brothers and sisters are dragged into court. Babies are killed in the womb. Children and young people are being brainwashed, separated from their parents, and mutilated. Do I have to go on? I bet some of you feel like I just gave you whiplash. Because on the one hand, I grieved the hostile and chaotic political and social atmosphere in our time. And at the same time, I affirmed real concern over the conflict and evils of our society. So which one is it, Tim? How should we respond to the issues of our day? Should we join in the culture war? Or should we take it all in stride? Well, that's a trick question, because I'm a preacher. Because out of the teaching of Daniel's passage today, I think that there's a third way. And as we look at our Old Testament reading in Daniel 7, we will see that the way we ought to respond to this chaos and concern is not joining the frenzy, not shrinking in disengagement, but to engage these issues as subjects of King Jesus. That's what our role is. But what does it mean when I say King Jesus or Jesus is King? That's one of those religious phrases that we hear so much that sometimes the use of it results in a loss of meaning. It's kind of like in a Bible study when I ask people what holy means, and they're like, I actually don't know, I just sing it a lot. And they're right, we use these words so much, they kind of lose their meaning. And so today as we look at Daniel chapter 7, it's going to be a refresher for us, and there are plenty of clues to illustrate what does it mean for Jesus to be king. I do want to say that as of this morning, this message was close to an hour. It is now down to about 25 minutes. So there is plenty of stuff in this passage for you guys to look on your own. It killed me each time having to break something off and being like, no, but it's so important. So it'll just be some things of what it means that Jesus is king. So in Daniel 7, the passage for today, it's a vision of God's powerful and apocalyptic, it's a vision from God, and it's a powerful apocalyptic coronation scene. And there's a lot of confusing components that could be overlooked. We had a shortened reading of that phrase, of that reading today, but I want to start at the beginning of the chapter because it's the most important part. So you picture with me, picture this in your mind as I'm going over this. I'm going to kind of translate this. You're standing on a beach, and there are storms forming all around, and the sky is dark. The cold winds chill your face. The moisture in the air dampens your clothes, and you hear the rustling sounds of waters as hideous monsters emerge. They have mismatched features and proportions borrowed from animal predators. Wings like an eagle, the likeness of a lion, a bear, and leopards. The last one comes out, and it has iron teeth, bronze claws, and 10 horns, one of which has eyes and a mouth and is talking, boasting. And they begin killing and trampling and devouring people. And as fear builds in you and the monsters tower over you and look your direction, something happens. Thrones begin to appear and get set in place. And one comes and sits on the throne. It's God. The passage calls him the Ancient of Days. And he sits in his seat, and as he comes forward to sit in his seat, you realize he's glowing white, surrounded in flames. And the blazing flames bursting forth from him and his throne warm your face and dry your clothes. The animals stop, the creatures stop and take notice. And you and them realize this majestic scene, and that surrounding the Ancient of Days are millions and billions and trillions of people, beyond number. And as the Ancient of Days sits, court proceedings begin. The monsters making their noise stop, and bang, the chief among them is slain, and his body is burned with fire. And the rest of them are stripped of their power. And then, in their defeat, you see a human being. The passage says, one like a son of man. He's coming on the clouds of heaven. And he approaches the Ancient of Days. And as we read this morning, he was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. And all nations and peoples of every language worshiped him. And his dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. This is an epic dream. The terror of monsters, the power of the Ancient of Days, and the shocking coronation of a human next to the Ancient of Days. This scene isn't just an ancient version of Avengers. The vision is constructed out of important and meaningful imagery. And so we're going to go over some of the most important pieces of that imagery. And as we do, it's going to illuminate what it means to be Jesus' king. And so the two things that I want to drive home today about what it means for Jesus to be king is, one, is that his authority, Jesus' authority, comes from God the Father. And two, that nothing is beyond his sovereign power. There is no earthly power outside of his sovereign control. Let's look first at how the passage teaches us that Jesus is king, and how that means that his authority comes from God. In Daniel's vision, after the epic defeat of the apocalyptic monsters, the passage says, the Son of Man comes, and it's God that coronates him, that crowns him, that gives him this authority. Now, this vision of a human has dual significance. It is a proxy for the people of God, and many people during Daniel's time would have read it that way. But Jewish scholars especially after Daniel's time, even before Jesus, began to see that this Son of Man wasn't just the people of God, that it was an illustration and a depiction of the prophesied coming Davidic king, the one who would set all things right, conquer evil in the world, and that would usher in God's kingdom. Jesus is the fulfillment of that Davidic king. And we know that that's the right way to interpret this passage. Why? Because Jesus himself uses that phrase, the Son of Man, to describe himself. And does so a bunch. And even actually, he says the Son of Man, in describing himself in the third person, he says, the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. What do you think he's talking about? He's talking about Daniel 7. And he is the one, he's the only one who uses that phrase to describe himself. No one else does that. And it's the thing he uses to describe himself more than any other phrase. The Son of Man. He wants us to know that this is him. So, in this moment, the giving of authority to the Son of Man is the giving of authority to an everlasting, immortal, it's giving the authority and everlasting and immortal kingdom to Jesus. And it's easy to miss these implications. You might be wondering, Tim, why are you belaboring this point? We do know that Jesus' authority comes from God. But the magic is in the implications. First, it means that there are power behind Jesus' words. Not just wonder-working power, as the beautiful song says, but real authority. Jesus is not some traveling preacher or philosopher sharing with others their best ideas. Such a philosopher can be appreciated or ignored at one's convenience, but not so with Jesus. And when we trust these preachers or these philosophers, they may or may not be wrong. We're taking a big risk when we buy into their life advice. I'm sure you guys have all been in a situation where someone gave you life advice and you're like, no. I know your life. Some of you guys, that happened with me. And so Jesus' authority, so Jesus the King has the real authority to tell us what the world is really like and how we really ought to behave. It's the difference between monopoly money and money based on the gold standard. The Christian, when at the point of difficult obedience, can know that when he's out on a limb, he's backed by something real, someone real. Furthermore, Jesus' authority comes from God. Not only does it validate his ministry, it also is a means of self-disclosure. It tells us who God is. Often Christians have a conflicting image of who God is. Some see Jesus as the safe, loving, and approachable one, and others as the Father who's distant and impossible to please, a taskmaster. I think this is why songs like A Good, Good Father is so meaningful to modern Christians. This is something that's been true of my life. One time I was at a college retreat, and I had put a lot of weight of hearing something fresh from God during this college retreat. It had happened every year previous. I was psyched. And it's a week-long college retreat, and I'm up there in the mountains, and I'm ready, and day one goes by, nothing. That's okay. There's still like 4 more days, 5 more days. Day 2 goes by, and my friends, they're starting to say, oh my gosh, God showed up in this quiet time, and he told me something powerful, and I didn't even realize. And it's like my friends, it's happening to them. They're like dropping like flies, and it's just me left. And I'm like, come on, and I'm like so worried. Is the Lord going to speak to me? Am I going to screw this up? Is God really going to be approachable? Am I going to be able to reach him? And so I put all my weight on me, all this weight on me, and this specific preacher that was going to be preaching later that week. I was a big fan of his and a friend of his. And so I'm psyched and ready, and I'm like, okay, the Lord's definitely going to speak to me through this preacher. And so he gets up and he starts sharing, and it had been a long week, late nights, early mornings. So I stopped paying attention and started dozing in the same sermon that I'm putting all my hope on, right? And so I'm starting to doze off, and finally I realized that I had missed. He's like, wrapping up. And I'm like, no, I missed the whole thing. My chance is gone. Will I ever hear from the Lord again? I was totally beating myself up. And he said, he was summing up, and he said these words. He said, Jesus is the image of the invisible God. So if you want to know who God is, all you have to do is look at who Jesus is. And just in that moment, look, I don't really believe in visions and dreams. They just keep happening to me. So I have to concede the point. In that moment, I had a vision before my waking eyes. It was like God the Father on his knees, ready to receive me. And instantly, it was like all I could see and all I could feel was just, I was moved. I was moved with a beautiful emotion. And I just said, the only thing I could say, I turned to my friend and I just, in tears coming down my face, big ugly cry. And I said, is that who God is? I had been a missionary and a leader for over a decade at that point. And I still had carried an image of God that was divided in my mind. God the Father's affirmation of Jesus' ministry is a self-disclosure of who God the Father is, what his heart is, and what his heart is for us. Acknowledging that Jesus is king means acknowledging that his authority comes from God. But this is my favorite part of this sermon. Acknowledging that Jesus is king means that he's supreme over all earthly powers. Did you know the monsters in Daniel's vision are more than just monsters? Has anyone broken this out for you guys? It is political imagery, which is, by the way, why I started this sermon talking about politics. The beast represents kings and kingdoms, and the horns represent kings. That's why it says in this passage, if you're familiar with it, that there's a horn with a mouth and human eyes, and he's boasting. It's because it represents a tyrannical and arrogant king. The violence and destruction they engage in is a metaphor for the oppression, violence, and destruction from governments that have set their face against the justice of God. This is why I opened this sermon referencing politics. Daniel's audience would have heard this vision not just as a spiritual statement or declaration, but also a political one. They, the whole time, would be, when they're hearing about these monsters, would be thinking about these unconquerable, despotic empires that oppressed them. But it's going to get even better. Ready? Check this out. Does anyone remember the context of the book of Daniel? It's the Babylonian exile. Okay, Tim, I don't remember. Okay, relax. I'm going to tell you right now. It's this. There was a civil war with the people of Israel. The 10 kingdoms were separated from the 2 southern kingdoms. The 10 northern kingdoms, who retained the name Israel, were wiped out by Assyria, and they were kidnapped. And then there was 2 remaining, the tribe of Benjamin, and the tribe of Judah. And that was called the kingdom of Judah. Those 10 tribes are lost. And these 2 tribes from the kingdom of Judah, they too were conquered. But they were conquered by the Babylonians, and they were kidnapped and trafficked over to the Babylonian Empire. This is the context of this passage. Daniel and his people were stolen from their lands, dragged to Babylon to serve the very empire and king that conquered them, that human trafficked them. This vision has come to Daniel not during a time of political victory and not during a time of dominance. It's not V-Day. There's no ticker-tape parade. But it was while he and his people were living as a stranger in a foreign land, as they were subject to ungodly and hostile powers. And the emphasis of this passage is that despite these events, in the face of these events of Daniel's life, despite the monsters and powers of his day, the Son of Man is king of an everlasting kingdom. And there will be a day when all enemies are placed under his feet. I think I want to repeat that again, at least a part of it. This vision has not come to Daniel during a time of political victory or dominance. It has nothing to do with that. But while he and his people were strangers in a foreign land, subject to ungodly and hostile powers. Christians, what do you think we are? This is not our home. Look, I love the United States and Constitution, probably more than most people I know. I have been known to read that and the Gettysburg Address and tear up. I think it's beautiful, and much of it is inspired by the Word. But this is not our world. When we were sealed as Christ's own forever, immediately our earthly citizenships and alliances they became secondary and a far second. We see this in other religions. When they migrate to a new country, their primary identity is their religion. In some ways, they care a lot less about what happens to the nation, because for them, they are that religion wherever they are. For us, we do not have that strong an identity. I remember a time where this crystallized for me. I had a friend who was a refugee from Cuba, just like the best guy ever. And he had been there a couple of years, and I was on this road trip with him, and we were talking about his family and how one of his families specifically misses Cuba a lot. And I asked him, how do you feel? Do you miss Cuba? And there was a long, pregnant pause. And he said, yes, I do. He says, but I don't know the words, so I'll say it in Spanish. He says, pero no es mi patria. Which, if you know what that means in Spanish, it means, yeah, I miss Cuba, but it's not my fatherland. It's not my homeland. I was shocked. I was his pastor at the time, but I was shocked by that clear distinction he had in his mind. He was a stranger in a foreign land, and he wanted to go home, but he knew his home wasn't Cuba. His hope was set on the risen Christ. His home was the kingdom of heaven. Now, here's the part where I offend everyone in this church. I shouldn't have gone into preaching to make friends. Please excuse me, but I have to say, there are some of you that have put too much of your hope riding on this election. Look, I voted too. The outcome of the election was important, is important, and our government, the United States government, will do justice, and it will do evil. And Christians are the people that are most equipped to engage and be a conscience for this nation. And it is okay and appropriate and important to have concern about what's going on. But some of you had your hope placed on who would lead or not lead this country. You know this because after the election, some of you were not only elated, but you felt like things were about to be set right. Because Trump is going to come and he's going to bring his kingdom and he's going to set everything right with the world. Don't get too excited, Democrats, you're next. This applies to you too. Some of you were grieved by the outcome, and it felt or feels so apocalyptic, like now we are in so much danger and now nothing can ever be set right again. Like this is it or this is the end. But it's not the return of Trump that will destroy the world and have it remade. It's the return of our King Jesus that will do that. Love him or hate him, it's not the leader of the nation that has the final word. It's Jesus the King. Look, when God freed people from slavery in Egypt, Jesus was king. And when Jesus was king, when Daniel was dragged into exile, the kingdom was on the move when John the Baptist was in prison. And on the day of Pentecost, Jesus was still king. Just like right after that, James was martyred. Jesus was king through all of those things. And since these events and countless beasts with their horns and teeth and claws have arisen from the seas and have faced the judgment of God, and some of these, for us, are not governments. Some of them are relationships or diagnoses. They're occupations. They're losses of loved ones. And each one of them growling, foaming at the mouth, towering over us as if they hold our life or our future in their hands. Well, they don't. They do not. Jesus is king. And today in your life, whether you're in victory or defeat, whether you're in joy or fear, set your hope on the risen Christ. He is the only King that matters. Jesus, as King, means his authority comes from the Father, and he is supreme over all earthly powers. I would like to close with a reading from Colossians 1. The Son is the image of the invisible God. He's the firstborn over all creation. For all things in heaven and on earth were created through him. Things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. And he is before all things. And in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in him, in everything, he might have supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through the blood of the cross. This is why Jesus being King is good news. Now, in a moment, we're going to pronounce this as we say the Nicene Creed. I'm going to say, please stand for the song of response. And everyone's going to go, ugh. And they're going to stand. And then we're going to say the Nicene Creed. And what I would like you to, I don't want you to pray to it. I don't want you to think, oh, I don't want you to make it an idol. In fact, it might already be. But some of you guys have monsters in your life. And it may be your political fears, or maybe you might have an idol. Maybe that's your political hopes. I want you to conjure that in your mind. And I want you to think about it. And in and over and against that thing, I want you to say the Nicene Creed as if you mean it. Because, I'm regretting saying as if you mean it, because it makes me feel like I told you guys you don't mean it. You guys mean it. I'm just saying extra mean it. All right, let's do this. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.